see here. Okay, so last time we discussed a bunch of stuff. We discussed some natural and deliberate experiments with humans and with primates that manipulated relative status and explored some outcomes related to both mental health and gene expression. We continued our consideration of absolute versus relative deprivation. And we discussed ways that manners or techniques that people can use to cope with stress, including social support. And I'm going to return to the topic of social interactions and social networks at length after next week. So on Tuesday, we have a midterm. Thursday, we have off. So the following Tuesday, we're going to begin a block where we discuss networks and get much more deeply into that topic. But today, I'd like to turn to another macro social structure, namely the neighborhood in which one lives, considering how that might affect your health. How does where you live affect your health above and beyond who you are? And this would seem to be an obvious contention that where you live might matter, but the pathways and the processes of such geographic effects on an individual's life chances are hard to tease out. And there's a whole lot of complexity in studying geographic effects on health. And actually, Maggie Traeger, the head TF in this class, is an expert on this topic. If you have particular questions, I'm sure you could ask her. But just to motivate our considerations for a moment, which colleges at Yale do you think have which reputations? So do the colleges differ in some way? Are some colleges, different than the others? Let me see if I can stop sharing here for a moment. Does it matter which college you are assigned to? Are they different in some way? Or are they all the same? This is not a trick question. You should all have an opinion on this fact. Who thinks all the colleges are the same? Raise your hands if you think all the colleges are the same. Okay, nobody has that belief. Okay, so some random student, why? Why are they not the same?
I mean, the colleges are different in size with the number of students as well as like the actual space, the physical space, and there are different amenities within each college. Like for example, Solomon has like the bookbinding room, but then like Branford has like the pottery room.
Okay, so first off, there are different physical aspects of the environment, the size of the college, the kind of space, the nature of the courtyard, the amenities, the bookbinding room or the theater and styles or whatever else, okay? Other things that might differ across the colleges. So you might care, for example, if you were into bookbinding or you were not an extrovert and you wanted to be in a small college, you might care if you were assigned to Branford or TD. Are there any other differences between the colleges? I'm really going to get pissed at you guys if you don't take this. Is easy. It's not. Help me out. Come on. There are no other differences other than that. Yes, Emily.
Yeah, just
so you guys know, I can see you all now because I stopped sharing my slides. So you're not invisible to me. Yeah. Emily.
Yeah, just the location of the colleges themselves, like Pauli Murray and Ben Franklin are pretty far away from cross campus, where there are colleges that are really close to cross campus and really close to the libraries.
Okay, good. So another way is their literal physical location in space, which is a slightly different thing than the kind of amenities or aspects of the college itself that Jennifer was talking about. And just to keep you guys thinking, that in turn might affect the proximity of the college to other aspects of New Haven, right? So some colleges, for example, might be closer to liquor stores or closer to GHEV, so you could get ice cream in the middle of the night, or closer to more crime, okay? So the physical location, you see, might have other implications for the experience of the students within the college, even if the students were randomly assigned. Any other differences among the colleges?
Proximity to the Harkis Tower, whose music is detrimental to student study sometimes.
Very good. So the noise environment, yes, the noise environment might be a problem. or the temptation, right? Like if you Mark, are saying, I don't like the noise, it's distracting me from our studies. Someone else might say, I have a weak constitution and I just want to dance. When I'm walking home, if I go by Toads, I want to dance. Yes, Ayman.
Sorry, I don't go to Yale, so I don't know this specifically, but don't they put like similar people together? Like they put athletes together? And
Well, let's ask the students. Do they do that?
damn.
No, so ostensibly, that's not the case. They do not assign them based on that. But which college has a reputation for self-confidence or smugness? Which is the smuggest college at Yale?
JE.
Okay, is there any disagreement on this point? This is a unanimous opinion of the members of this. JE sucks. Is that right? Okay. Which college has the reputation for being kind of, the most incestuous college? Maybe this reputation has been lost. Okay, in the olden days, this was TD. We always thought of TD as being the most, and we always used to explain it by the fact that they were far away, they were very insular, they had sex among themselves, the freshmen were there, to also change the dynamics. So this was the perception of TD in the olden days. Which one is the most attractive college? Which is the most beautiful college? I don't mean the people, although maybe there's opinions about this, I don't know. I meant physically, the physical environment. Branford, right? Branford and Berkeley are often considered. So there are a number of other kinds of differences that might occur in the colleges, and already we've begun to speak about at least two different ways. One might be something about the physical situation of the college, or attributes of the college that are independent of the students in the college. In other words, if you depopulated the colleges, some of them would be closer or further from campus, for example. And other attributes that depend on who the people are within the college. For example, how smug the college is not an attribute of the college, it's an attribute of the people within the college. And I'll come back to this point in just a moment. All right, let me share my slides again now. Just so you guys know, when I stop sharing my slides, I can actually see you. So I do expect you to raise your hands, especially for easy questions like that. Okay, here, let's see here. Presenter view. Okay, and then get my little pointer back up here. Okay. And the question is, another question you might begin to ask yourself is, if this pattern persists across generations, so that, TD was incestuous 40 years ago when I was a student and still is today, despite the fact that the students are mostly randomized to colleges, although not always, and none of you explained that little vagary, which most of you are familiar with. If this pattern, this property of a college persists, despite the fact that the students are randomized and across time, so the students totally turn over every 4 years, what does this tell us about the colleges? And this is the key difference between composition and context when we're thinking about neighborhood effects. And now remember this idea from a few lectures ago. This is the compositional and contextual effects of neighborhoods. On the one hand, we might believe that neighborhood context matters. This is the difference that places make to people. Or neighborhood composition might matter. And this is the difference that people make to places. So suppose, for example, that neighborhood A has twice the mortality of neighborhood B. Well, what would we conclude? We say, oh my God, the people in neighborhood A are dying at twice the rate as the people in neighborhood B. Well, what if everyone in neighborhood A is very old? Old people live in neighborhood A and young people live in neighborhood B. Wouldn't that possibly explain the difference? Or maybe there is really something worse about neighborhood A, like it has a toxic waste dump in the neighborhood, and that's what causes it. That's the difference between context and composition. And it's a really thorny problem when you're trying to figure out, is there something bad or good about this neighborhood when it comes to people's health. So today we're going to examine the evidence that context really does matter, even after taking into account composition. And we're going to consider some possible mechanisms for this, a process. Now, a concern for the geographic structuring of health and social factors is actually an old one. This is Booth's famous map from over 100 years ago of poverty in London, completed actually not long after John Snow's geographic analysis of cholera. And this analysis by Booth is quite famous in its own regard, and it's actually very beautiful. And so Booth maps London and he goes, okay, where is the poorest people who are also vicious and semi-criminal? You know, he has a kind of different perception from 100 years ago. Very poor, casual, chronic want. These people are poor. These are some mixed and some poor, fairly comfortable, and so on. Upper middle classes and upper middle and upper classes and the wealthy people. And he starts mapping the neighborhoods of London. And in fact, these are the neighborhoods still to this day. And in fact, some of these neighborhoods have these qualities over 100 years later, as if there's something about the neighborhood, not necessarily the people themselves, that may have such effects. Well, how could neighborhoods matter? Let's look at some of, more closely at some of the attributes of how place might affect health. And you guys already put, when I asked you about the Yale colleges, already put some of these ideas on the table. So what might be mechanisms by which neighborhoods could influence health? Maybe it's the physical environment, the air pollution, the noise, one of you pointed out, the housing stock, the traffic patterns, the scenicness, how beautiful and scenic is the environment. Or it could be something to do with the service environment of the neighborhood, groceries, fast food outlets, health clinics, doctor supply, pharmacies, and so on. Or something about the social environment, the social disorder, crime, local norms, attitudes about how we behave, for example, social capital, which is a topic I keep alluding to, and I will come back to it, don't worry, of the local environment. So let's take a quick look at some of the evidence for the effects of place before I focus on three key examples at the end of the lecture today, two with respect to health related to the Chicago heat wave and the so-called moving to opportunity experiment, the MTO experiment. It's a very famous experiment, and one last experiment with respect to other outcomes. This is a really well done study looking at small area effects on cardiovascular events, the so-called ERIC study. It had 4 communities around the country, 13,000 residents who were followed for 9 years, and it had 615 incident coronary events like heart attacks. And it looked at neighborhood disadvantage of the block group where you lived. So a block group is a small little area of, let's say, 10 blocks or something like that. So everyone was put into a tiny little neighborhood. And then we looked at, does that neighborhood where you live affect your probability of having a heart attack, even after accounting for individual income, education, occupation, smoking, and other factors? In other words, above and beyond all the attributes that inhere in you, is there something about where you live? Maybe the air pollution where you live, maybe the stress of the noise or the crime or something else about where you live increases your risk, for example, of a heart attack. That's the scientific question. And what they found was, in fact, some such relationship. This shows neighborhood disadvantage and coronary heart disease. This is incidence per 1,000 person years of follow-up. And it looks at, okay, the poorest people, middle income people, and upper income people. Unsurprisingly, the richer you are, the less likely you are to have a heart attack or a coronary artery disease. But now within each group, we look at, does it matter whether your neighborhood is the worst neighborhood, middle neighborhood, or least bad neighborhood, has the least disadvantage. And we see this graded pattern, even after adjusting for the individual's income and for other factors. Evidence, in other words, that something about the neighborhood where you live might increase your risk of heart disease. And note here that we're unlike the inequality lecture we had recently, we're not looking at the inequality of the neighborhood where you live. So this slide is similar to some slides we saw a couple of lectures ago. So we're not looking at within each income group, how is inequality associated with health outcomes? Now we're looking at within each individual income group, how is the average wealth of your neighborhood associated with your outcomes, and we see the same pattern. And previous studies have suggested that greater amounts of green space are associated with better health. This slide shows green space, scenicness, and health at a particular geographic level in the United Kingdom, and this was taken from your readings. The authors calculated the average scenic rating of all scenic or not photographs taken for each area and depicted in the ratings. And visual inspection of maps A and B, which were in the paper, reveals that while scenicness and green land cover are significantly correlated, so those areas that have more green space are in general also seen as more scenic, there appear to be differences, for example, in the eastern part of England. So these are green spaces, but they're not seen as scenic. And then in map C, they looked at respondents to the 2011 census, how they classified their health from very good to fair to bad and so on. And they calculated health rates using something known as the standardized morbidity ratio, which is the ratio of the observed to the expected number of cases of bad health for a particular population after accounting for age and gender and so on. And what they find in summary is that the geographic differences in health can be explained by scenicness and green space, both of them, but especially by scenicness. Something about living in a scenic environment, after adjusting for other factors, may be associated with individuals living longer. But to be clear, this analysis is an analysis that's known as an ecological analysis, which I'll explain in one moment. In other words, what they found is that various measures that describe attributes of places are associated with each other. That scenic places are healthy places. But they did not find this they did not examine this at the level of individuals. They did not say, this study cannot say, does living in a scenic place make an individual healthier? It just says that scenic places are places where there are healthy people. And this problem that I'm introducing to you right now, which is a very crucial problem conceptually when it comes to neighborhood effects, and statistically when it comes to neighborhood effects, is called the ecological fallacy. Let's say, for example, you look at 3 different places and you just stand there and you look around and you see what fraction of the people are wearing hats. And you find that, oh, in this place, 1 out of 5 or 20% of the people are wearing hats. And in this place, you find that 2 out of 5 or 40% of the people are wearing hats. And in this place, you find that 3 out of 5 or 60% of the people are wearing hats. And let's say, for the sake of argument, you also quantify how many people in each place have cancer. So in this place, 1 out of 5 has cancer, 20% have cancer, 40% have cancer, and 60% have cancer. If you plotted at the level of place the fraction of people with hats and the fraction of people with lung cancer, you would get perfect prediction. But if you look at the individual level data, you should see that there's no relationship between wearing hats and having cancer. In other words, this correlation between hat wearing and cancer is true at the ecological level, at the level of neighborhoods. But even while it's true at the ecological level, is not true at the individual level. There's no relationship, no biological relationship at the individual level of hat wearing and cancer risk. So in other words, concluding that hats cause lung cancer based on data such as this would be wrong and would illustrate the ecological fallacy. But here's another subtlety which is difficult but important. This fallacy is only relevant if indeed we are trying to make individual level claims. In other words, it is only relevant if we are trying to claim that there's an association that's seen at the neighborhood level necessarily holds at the individual level. In other words, if we took data like this and said, oh, this means that wearing hats causes cancer, that would be the wrong thing to do. It would not be wrong to say high hat wearing neighborhoods are high cancer neighborhoods. So if in fact we are actually affirmatively interested just in neighborhood attributes, we would not have to worry about the ecological fallacy. But we do have to be careful in our interpretations and in our statistical analyses regardless. That is, it is one thing to study the effects of place or the association of group level observations on individuals, but it is another to assume that these effects are actually operating at the individual level. So if we're actually interested in the effects of place at the individual level, we need a more sophisticated set of analyses to avoid this fallacy, one that takes into account individual attributes and one that is actually estimated at the individual level. Okay, well, with that little methodologic digression, let's return to looking at some attributes of place that might have a relationship with attributes of individual health if their studies are done properly. This is another aspect of the individual environment. This is the number of streets you have to cross when going to school. So this is the average number of streets crossed for students, the children in a particular school district, and this is the injury rate per thousand. And you find that, places that are geographically organized such that school kids have to cross more streets in order to get to school, unsurprisingly, are places where we have more accidents. The layout of streets and the location of schools over which individuals can have little control, this structural factor, can affect the risk of individuals for being injured. Or here's another example. Where you live affects what recreational facilities you have nearby. This shows two neighborhoods of Glasgow. One is rich and one is poor. And the rich neighborhood has athletic tracks and boating ponds and bowling greens and cycle tracks and playing fields and putting greens. It's Scotland after all, so they've got two putting greens in the rich neighborhood. And on, tennis courts and swimming pools for a total of 61 such amenities, whereas unsurprisingly, the poor neighborhood has none of these factors available. Or here's another example. Where you live can affect whether you're exposed to bed bugs. This was a project that took off a few years ago. I don't know if it's still in existence. It was a crowdsourced bed bug registry in New York. If you encountered bed bugs at your hotel, you were supposed to upload a complaint, and these were geographically mapped, the bedbugregistry.com. And this was a way that you could assess the prevalence of bed bugs in a particular community. This was a free public database of user-generated bedbug reports, actually for the whole United States and Canada. And it was founded in 2006, and it has tens of thousands of locations. And unsurprisingly, an ad for Terminix here, which sort of makes sense given the objective. Here's an aspect of the service environment. Where you live affects the availability of fast food outlets. This shows the population, the number of people per outlet, and there are and this is the weekly income in the district. So in the richer districts, there are more people per outlet, or fewer fast food joints per person in the richer districts. The poorer districts have fewer people per outlet, or more outlets per person. So poorer people are more exposed to potentially unhealthy fast food opportunities. And this is here's another one, the medical service attribute, like bed bugs in New York City. So where you live affects what kinds of medication you can get. This shows opioid pain relief supplies in pharmacies in New York neighborhoods. So this shows the race and ethnic composition of the neighborhood, percent Black. So this is the non-minority, and this is the high minority or high Black community. And it shows the number of pharmacies. So of course, there are more pharmacies in the more white neighborhoods. And this shows the percent of outlets that have opioids. Opioids are things like morphine that you can use to treat pain. This was very, very important to me in my practice because I primarily took care of these people. I took care of poor, primarily African-American patients, and I wanted to prescribe morphine to them to relieve their pain. And my patients would tell me, "Doc, I can find a pharmacy, but when I go to the pharmacy, they don't have morphine to prescribe to me." So it was hard for them to get the medicine that they needed as they were dying because of where they lived, okay? So this is a medical service factor. Or broader factors. For example, because place matters a lot in healthcare. All kinds of things vary from place to place. And the American experience of death varies remarkably from one community to another, not just with respect to whether you have access to opioids, but whether a person is hospitalized near the end of life, or admitted to an ICU, or is seen by a doctor, and so on. This slide shows so-called geographic variation according to 306 hospital referral regions. The country is divided into 306 regions, and it shows the use of doctors near the end of life. It comes from a very famous resource called the Dartmouth Atlas. And where you live is associated with whether you're able to use a specialist at the end of life. This shows ratio of rates of medical specialist visits during the last 6 months of life compared to the US average. And these are higher than average use of specialists and lower than average use of specialists. And there's variation from place to place in our country. In addition, the chance that the decedent was an inpatient in an acute care hospital at the time of death varied by as much as a factor of 3, depending on where they lived. Or the chance of being admitted to an intensive care unit varied by a factor of almost 5, from 6.3% using ICU care to 30% of using ICU care from place to place. These are not agency factors, these are structural factors. And where you live also affects whether you have sensible vaccinated neighbors. This is a big deal right now with the COVID pandemic. You might get vaccinated, but the vaccine is not perfect, 95% efficacy, and your neighbors might not get vaccinated, even though they should, even though actually by law they could even be required to be vaccinated. It's an old precedent in our country, because you may choose not to be vaccinated and take the risk of dying yourself, but you're not at liberty to spread a contagious disease to me. So the state has an interest in obliging people to be vaccinated. And furthermore, as I said, even if you're vaccinated, still whether you get the disease might depend on whether your neighbors choose to do so. So given the negative externalities of vaccine refusal, that is to say the negative spillover effects, and the manifest public interest in epidemic control, the United States Supreme Court ruled in 1905 in a landmark case that states could pass and enforce compulsory vaccination. Of course, states could allow exemptions for diverse reasons, including for religious or personal views. But people began to abuse this. And as you saw in your readings, there's geographic clustering in non-medical exemptions. So of course, we would give people exemptions from vaccination for medical reasons, if they might be killed by the vaccine, because they have the lack of a good immune system or whatever. Of course, we would give them such an exemption. But we also, many states allowed for non-medical exemptions. And this system was eventually abused, and it resulted in the local accumulation of critical masses of susceptible children whose parents had chosen not to vaccinate them, maybe hoping that everyone else's children would be vaccinated and that would somehow be beneficial to their children without themselves having to make any contribution to their community by being vaccinated themselves. And the county level rate of vaccination, of the exemption rate among children in Washington varied from 1.2% to nearly 27%. In this county here, 27% of the people filed a non-medical exemption rate, whereas, I don't know, in other counties, I don't know, King County, it was 5.5%, Pacific County, 3.4%. So a lot of variation from place to place in whether your neighbors exempt themselves from vaccination. And this geographic clustering of vaccine refusal can result in outbreaks in an area population, including among innocent bystanders, such as infants or immunocompromised individuals, or in individuals who did get a vaccine, but the vaccine is not perfect. And unusually, however, with respect to vaccine exemptions in our country, the unvaccinated children tend to be richer and whiter, and tend to have a married mother with a college education. It's almost like those culture-bound syndromes we talked about much earlier in the class, where these types of people develop these sort of systems of beliefs about whether vaccination is reasonable or not and reinforce themselves for this practice. One investigation by a California newspaper found that vaccination rates in wealthy neighborhoods of Santa Monica and Beverly Hills had declined so much that whooping cough made a reappearance in our country. Parents in these schools were submitting personal belief exemption forms, PBE forms. And in some of these schools, up to 60 or 70% of parents filed for such exemptions. Whooping cough is not a joke. Your children can die from whooping cough. And this rate of non-vaccination exceeds the rates seen in many desperately poor countries like Haiti. So rich districts in California have non-vaccinations similar to many developing world nations. And an inevitable result of this is more outbreaks of preventable disease, in particular hotspots. This map only represents kids whose parents have taken a stance against vaccines by applying for personal belief exemptions. So it shows whether you have sensible vaccinated neighbors. This shows the share of public school kindergartners with personal belief exemptions to vaccination requirements from very little to very high exemptions in the state of California. And you can see hotspots of large fractions of people filing for these. The actual number of kindergartners entering school without their full slate of vaccines is actually even higher than this map suggests. These are only the people, this map just shows people who filed the paperwork for it. And statewide, about 2.5% of kindergartners fall in this category. But nearly 10% of California kindergartners don't start school fully vaccinated. And most of these kids are so-called conditional entrants who are allowed to start, but who for whatever reasons are behind in their vaccines and say they're planning on getting them. It's also worth noting that this map only shows public school kids, as geographic data for private schools isn't easily available. But kindergartners in private schools are actually more than twice as likely, 5.3%, of having a PBE, a personal belief exemption, compared to public school kids, which, as I said, was 2.5%. So this is a problem. This is a serious public health problem in our society. And it's rearing its head now with COVID. Back in 2000, only 0.77% of California kindergartners had PBEs, but by 2013, that percentage had more than quadrupled to 3.15%. As if vaccine avoidance is a kind of fad or a fashion or a kind of social normative factor or is spreading through social networks, a topic that I'll return to in a few lectures. But in some individual school districts, the actual PBE rate is even higher. At River Springs Charter School in Temecula, California, nearly a quarter of 556 kindergartners have personal belief exemptions. A third of the kindergartners at Visions in Education Public School in Carmichael hold PBEs, as do 51% of kindergartners at Ocean Grove Charter School in Boulder Creek. In fact, at a handful of private schools, the PBE rate is 75% or more. This is not sound public health policy. It's also dangerous to the children. And it's not only dangerous to their own children, but it's dangerous to other people's children to not vaccinate your children. And it goes without saying that a measles outbreak in these communities could be devastating. These parents are gambling with the lives not only of their own children, which itself, by the way, is contentious. Parents have considerable authority over the healthcare of their children, but not unending. You cannot decide not to treat your child for leukemia. That would be seen as a kind of child neglect, and the state would intervene. And in fact, you cannot decide or should not be able to decide to not vaccinate your kid against measles just because you say so. In fact, some children, because when you do that, you're not only gambling with your own child's life, but also with the lives of others, especially young children and toddlers who aren't old enough to actually get their vaccines. For instance, 6 of the Disneyland measles cases that in the 2015 outbreak were among infants that were too young to be vaccinated. Those little kids were put at risk by people who chose not to be vaccinated. And this problem is becoming very important now with the COVID-19 situation. This shows some data through last November, that the Gallup polling firm collected across time. It said if an FDA-approved vaccine to prevent COVID-19 were available right now at no cost, would you agree to be vaccinated? And the percentage saying yes was, high back in July, sort of fell to 50%, but started rising as the vaccine approval neared to 63%. That's great, but it's still not high enough. We're going to, as we discussed when we discussed herd immunity for vaccination a while back, we're going to need rates that are, as high as we can get in order to reopen our society. At least 50% will need to be vaccinated, and the more, the better. Okay, so those are some attributes of physical environment. Let's take a look at some attributes of the social environment and how it might affect your health risks. For example, crime and a general breakdown in the social fiber of a community have been shown to be associated with health outcomes of residents of those communities. And here's one objective way to assess the physical environment to get insight into the social environment. This is the famous Broken Windows Index. You're trying to get a sense of what kind of people are in this neighborhood or what kind of social environment is in this neighborhood. And you ask, well, maybe I can measure something about the physical space that will give me a clue to that. So you can look, for instance, at the percent of properties with major structural damage or the street segments with graffiti. Just because you're poor doesn't mean you have to put graffiti on the walls, or the street segments with accumulated garbage, or the street segments with abandoned vehicles. These are taken to be indicators of social disarray, independent of relative poverty of the neighborhoods. And you can combine these into a single index. And nowadays, in fact, things like this can even be assessed with so-called big data techniques, with computational social science techniques, often automatically, using things like Google Street View, or as we saw in the scenicness study of photographs that people have posted online. So for example, you could just use Google Street View and process the images of photographs of block faces for every street in a neighborhood. All the photographs have already been collected by Google Street View. You can use machine learning techniques to process the photographs. You can rate the block faces according to whether there's graffiti and garbage and vehicles and structural damage, and automatically create indices that assign this Broken Windows Index to neighborhoods. When I first was at the University of Chicago and some of these ideas were invented there over 20 years ago, in those days, people would drive through dangerous and other neighborhoods hanging out the back of a car with a video camera, taking pictures. And then these things would be manually rated in order to create some assessment of the physical disarray and hence presumably the social disarray of a neighborhood. And there's a link between this measure and things like STD, sexually transmitted disease transmission, if you can believe it. Even net of the actual poverty of the neighborhood, even net of the traits of the individuals involved. So this shows the relationship between the Broken Windows Index and the rates of gonorrhea per 1,000 people in New Orleans neighborhoods. So we have low poverty neighborhoods and high poverty neighborhoods. And independent, we have low broken windows and high broken windows neighborhoods. So for example, if you have low broken windows, so you use the physical environment to get a sense of the social disarray, you find that the rate of gonorrhea is similar, whether you have low poverty or high poverty. There's not much difference. So even though this neighborhood is poor, its rate of gonorrhea is not higher than a rich neighborhood if you don't have as much social disarray. But regardless of whether the neighborhood is poor or rich, if you have a high Broken Windows Index, the rate of gonorrhea is higher in the low poverty neighborhood and in the high poverty neighborhood compared to the low Broken Windows Index. Of course, it's worst of all if you have both high poverty and high broken windows. So it's not just how poor a neighborhood is, but also something about the social fiber of the community that is material to the risk of venereal disease. We'll examine how neighborhoods can affect norms with respect to seemingly unrelated behaviors in just a bit. You might be asking, well, how exactly does it come to happen that this Broken Windows Index is, associated with gonorrhea rates? We'll see in just a moment. This is what a low broken windows environment might look like, even though it's poor in New Orleans. This is a low gonorrhea but high poverty neighborhood in New Orleans. And maybe you get a hint of what a difference might be. Similarly, areas that are relatively free of crime and that have greater social cohesion are also areas that had fewer deaths during the famous Chicago heat wave of 1995. Most of you are, probably all of you are too young to remember this, but I was a new assistant professor in 1995, and I had just arrived in Chicago to begin my job. And that summer had one of the worst heat waves in Chicago in the last 100 years. The little apartment we had just rented when I was a new assistant professor had one air conditioner. We were lucky to have an air conditioner, and all of us slept in the same room during the heat wave, trying to stay cool at night. But other people were desperate. They maybe didn't have air conditioning, and they slept outside in the open air or in city parks. So hot was it even at night in Chicago. So this slide shows the correlation, the ecological correlation between low crime rates and heat wave deaths during the Chicago heat wave. So this shows, these are the 15 areas with the highest violent crime rate, and these are the 15 areas with the highest heat-related death rate. And you can see a correlation visually between high crime and high heat-related death rates. Now, one mechanism for that you might already be thinking about, you might be saying, wait a minute, if you're in a stuffy indoor environment suffering from the heat, maybe becoming dehydrated, or if you're already sick with other problems, the heat is exacerbating your illness and increasing your risk of dying. If you have a bad neighborhood and it's high crime, you don't have the luxury of going outside and sleeping outside because you might be robbed or killed. So you stay inside and you're more likely to die. That's a pretty straightforward causal link. You know, high crime reduces your willingness to go outside even despite the heat. You stay indoors, you have more stifling heat exposure, which in turn has these physiologic effects and adversely affects your health. Pretty straightforward. But there are other subtle things that could be going on as well. Let's look. There were over 700 excess deaths during the heat wave, but they were unequally distributed across the city. This slide shows the so-called heat index, or the apparent temperature, which is a function of the temperature and the relative humidity, and total deaths from July 12th to 19th in 1995. So for example, here are the number of deaths, and here's the heat index. And this shows the heat index is peaking here on July 13th. And this shows the total deaths that with some delay, like a 3-day delay, peaks over here. And then we can partition the deaths. What's the cause of death? Due to heat and cardiovascular disease alone, or due to the heat alone. So we can see like what is the excess deaths from. But it also shows deaths of particular subjects. It also shows the deaths of particular subjects in a study of causes of deaths. So in other words, we can actually now begin to drill down and look at the individual level. After accounting for attributes of the individuals, we can say something about how the neighborhood environment in which people lived affected the ability of individuals to survive the heat. So we're not any longer going to just say areas with high crime were areas with high heat deaths. Now we're going to try to understand, well, what mechanistically happened in that situation. This shows living conditions and type of social contacts as risk factors for mortality during the Chicago heat wave in a very well conducted study published now 24 years ago of 339 matched pairs of subjects and controls. So for example, we look at what fraction of people who had access to an air-conditioned lobby, what fraction of people who died during the heat wave had access to air conditioning in the lobby, and what fraction of people who did not die, who were otherwise similar, had access to an air-conditioned lobby. And we found that among the people that died, 10% had access to air conditioning, and among the people who did not die, 20% had access to air conditioning. So this is pretty obvious. It says, oh, if you live in a part of town or in a building that has air conditioning in the lobby, you know, if you're really suffering, you're a person with congestive heart failure and it's hot, you can at least go down to the air conditioned lobby. This could save your life. But now let's look at some other things. Participating in group activities, same pattern. Individuals who participate in group activities are less likely to die during the heat wave. Having access to transportation, 92% of the controls who did not die had access to transportation, and a lower number of the decedents had access. Or having a pet in the home. Having a pet in the home reduce your risk of death. Why? Because when you have a pet in the home, you have to go out to walk the pet and take care of the pet. And getting out of a stifling hot environment was associated with your health. So it's not a stretch to imagine that local neighborhoods could affect your opportunities for these types of things, for having the ability to participate in a group activities, for having access to transportation, or being able to leave your house to walk your pet, okay? So here you are, you're at the individual level. These are risk factors measured at the individual level. And now what I'm asking you to see is that the neighborhood level could affect your individual level risk, exposures. And that is how neighborhood effects might be translated into individual level risks and therefore individual level deaths. Sociologist Eric Kleinenberg has looked at this topic in depth in his book called Heat Wave. And here are some results for a comparison that he did, a qualitative comparison of two Chicago neighborhoods that had similar socioeconomic parameters, but very different outcomes in the heat wave based on other attributes other than how rich or poor they were, such as the social capital and measures of civic life of these neighborhoods. So he looked at two communities, North Lawndale and South Lawndale, and he looked at the fraction of seniors that were in poverty. They were sort of comparable. Both were poorer than Chicago as a whole. Looked at the fraction of seniors living alone. They were sort of comparable. And this is Chicago as a whole. And here's the death rate, which was 10 times higher in North Lawndale than South Lawndale. And the question is why? This is a street view of the North Lawndale neighborhood. Not as nice. So North Lawndale, remember, was the worst one. So not as nice as South Lawndale. This is the South Lawndale, okay? This is the street view of South Lawndale and North Lawndale. Very different social life in these two neighborhoods. Kleinenberg points to the relevance of commercial and social life in South Lawndale, which is also known as Little Village, which pulled isolated seniors into public places and provided seniors with safe, air-conditioned commercial venues, for example. And here's what some residents had to say. This is North Lawndale, which was worse. I had no fear, this is Father Michael, one of the priests. I had no fear until they told me, oh no, it's not safe. These people steal on the corners and so on. They would tell me that there would be drive-by shootings. They would fight among themselves, but I would be caught in the crossfire. And some feared even that if you walk, they can come and snatch you. And this is South Lawndale, Father Morales. He says, even though we have gangs, people still feel comfortable in the streets. You walk around and you see people sitting on the front steps everywhere. Or here's a resident. We look out for each other in our neighborhood. If something is going on, we'll see it and call each other or the police. This collective attribute of the neighborhood made all the difference, it seems, in whether individual residents lived or died of the heat during the heat wave. Let me just pause there for a moment. Where am I? Let me see if I can escape here. Stop sharing. Are there any questions so far? Does it make sense so far? You're with me? I can see you all now, so I can see the vacant stares on some of your faces, and I can see the nodding and the engagement on others. I just want you to know. And smiles. Smiles are good. Okay. And let's see how many of you are not even on, don't even have your videos turned on. A whole bunch of you. Oh, everyone's turning on their videos now. Molly and Zoe and Lorenzo and Grace and Cecilia. Yeah, Christelle. There we go. All right. Any questions or comments? Yes. Noemi.
Hi, yeah. So I was just wondering, going back to like the vaccination trend, there's obviously been like a lot of research on the benefits of vaccine. So I was wondering why was that college educated people were more likely to not vaccinate their children?
I think it's a cultural phenomenon. These people reinforce themselves. It's like a high status belief. You know, they were persuaded by some false. I mean, vaccines are miraculous substances. They're not without any risk at all. But the risk is so minuscule compared to the benefits that it's really not reasonable, except in certain unusual circumstances of your kid is immunocompromised or some other circumstance. It's not reasonable to choose not to be vaccinated, but it becomes a fashion. You know, why do people wear their hair in a certain way or hold certain other beliefs? There are all kinds of beliefs that even you hold, and you hold those beliefs because your friends hold them, not because you've reflected yourself or come to that conclusion yourself. There's a very famous saying by a longshoreman and a socialist social critic by the name of Eric Hoffer. He said, when people are free to choose anything they want, they choose what others choose, which is a really sad commentary on our species in some ways. It's actually, I wrote a whole book about this called, actually it's a book about many things. It's called Blueprint. But we are social animals, and we like to copy the beliefs of our neighbors, even if they're false, even if we wouldn't have those beliefs if we thought about it on our own. So I think that's what's happening with a lot of the anti-vax community. And then at some point, it becomes very difficult to admit you've made a mistake. And so kind of stubbornness sets in as well. So it's a fashion. That's my best, easiest explanation for it. It's like peanut allergies, by the way. I don't teach this in class anymore, but I used to. There is a core of kids who clearly have autism, but we've had an epidemic of autism in our society in the last 20 years. Nobody thinks that the actual incidence of autism has gone up. What probably has happened is the diagnoses of autism. In fact, we talked about this. I assigned a reading about this a while ago. Same with peanut allergies. When I was 20 years ago, everyone's kids had peanut allergies. Yes, there had been some rise in peanut allergies. And yes, some core of children do have peanut allergies. But many parents they would see, oh, so-and-so, Susie's child has a peanut allergy. Maybe my child has a peanut allergy too. You can't be sure. Let's just assume that my child has a peanut allergy. And so there was an epidemic of peanut allergies, which now is sort of behind us a little bit. You used to not be able to go onto planes. Planes stopped serving peanuts. You couldn't bring peanuts onto planes. Those rules have kind of waned. It was a kind of a fad. So again, to be very clear, I am absolutely not saying that autism or peanut allergies are wholly socially constructed or that they are wholly culture-bound syndromes, but they are partly those things. And the same kind of thing obtains with vaccine avoidance. Some people are harmed by vaccines. Some are killed by them. Some few people legitimately should not be vaccinated, but those are small numbers, cannot explain the very large numbers of people opposed to vaccination in our society. Any other questions before I resume? All right. Oops. Maggie, can you see the slide?
Yep, looks good.
Thank you. All right. So now we can begin to think about some of the problems with all of the studies that I've shown you so far, whether quantitative or qualitative, when it comes to making inferences about, in fact, do the neighborhoods have the effects we think they might have? And this is the thorny methodologic problem, the challenges in neighborhood research. So for example, the difficulty in disentangling compositional from contextual effects. I mentioned this to you already. And one solution to that is multi-level analysis. So you do statistical analysis that looks both at individuals and at neighborhoods. And there's a certain statistical set of tools you can use that let you kind of tell the difference between the constituent individuals in a neighborhood and the neighborhood itself. Or the ecological fallacy that I also mentioned to you. And here you can use individual level data. Unlike the scenicness study, you could try to use data that actually got to the individual level. Like, for example, the broken windows index and the gonorrhea. Did this person actually get gonorrhea themselves? Not what's the gonorrhea rate in this neighborhood and the broken windows rate in this neighborhood, but we follow individuals. Another problem is, which I haven't mentioned, is the problem of household mobility. People choose where to live and they move. So maybe sick people can't leave a neighborhood. So only the healthy people leave a neighborhood because they have more money or something. Or maybe you love McDonald's, so you choose to live near McDonald's. So it's not that the McDonald's is making you unhealthy, it's that you are already unhealthy and you wanted to live near a McDonald's, which incidentally, I completely understand because of course I love McDonald's, but that's not the point. Or a problem that is known as endogeneity, which is this sort of two-way causation problem that we've been talking about in the class periodically, which is what causes what? How can we be sure? Maybe the people change the neighborhood as much as the neighborhood changes the people. And here there are a couple of kinds of ways we can approach it. This so-called instrumental variables is a fancy way of saying sort of natural experiments or actually real experiments. Let's look at some real experiments. Actually, so endogeneity and identifying neighborhood effects on health, one of the problems is that people choose where they live. So those who don't like their neighborhood and are able to do so might move out. Or sick people might move closer to amenities. In other words, if you know you have diabetes, you might say, I'm choosing whether to buy this house or that house, and this house is closer to the hospital. And that's where I'm going to live. Or services choose where to locate. Junk food outlets might move in where there's already demand. In other words, it's not that the existence of the McDonald's prompts people to buy more McDonald's. It's the fact that McDonald's knows where people are their customers and puts the McDonald's near people who already were prone to acting in a way that might be injurious to their health. So in an ideal world, we would like to do an experiment where we randomize people to where they live or to what kind of environment they might face. And there have been a number of such difficult, rare experiments at different scales over the last 20 years. Here's an example of a classic study that was almost a full experiment. It shows where you are hospitalized can affect your recovery. So in this particular hospital, people were assigned to pay their rooms at random. And some of the rooms had windows where you could see the trees. And some of the rooms, you could only see the brick wall. So some people were randomly assigned to a scenic view, and some people were not, kind of like in the movie In a Room with a View. Some could see the Arno River and some could not in that little pensione at the beginning of the movie. 46 patients who underwent cholecystectomy, who had their bladder removed between 1972 and 1981 in a 200-bed Pennsylvania hospital were studied. And these subjects were grouped into 23 pairs, one member of which looked out at trees and the other who looked at bricks. And several outcomes were evaluated, including length of stay and the use of pain medication. And length of stay was about 1 day shorter in those people who had views of trees, about 8 days versus 8.7 days. And analgesic use was also lower. This shows the number of doses of analgesia and the strength by the group that looked at walls and the group that looked at trees. So on the first day after the operation, there's not a lot of difference in the use of strong analgesics, whether you're looking at a wall or a tree, because you just got out of surgery and it doesn't matter whether there's a tree or a brick wall. But days 2 to 5, Big difference in the use of strong analgesia. The wall group, they want to be medicated and they're asking for opioids. The tree group, a third of the rate. And then finally, by day 6 or 7, not a lot of difference again, because by then you're well beyond the time when the surgery caused you pain in your abdomen. So being randomly assigned to look at trees from your hospital window reduced your length of stay and changed the physiology of your response to surgery, reducing the need for pain medication. Very ingenious, classic study done with small numbers, published in one of the most famous journals of science 40 years ago. I love this kind of work. But here's another true experiment. This is the very famous Moving to Opportunity study. And between 1994 and 1997, 4,000 families in Baltimore, Boston, Chicago, LA, and New York were randomly assigned to get a housing voucher that could be used to move to a low poverty neighborhood, along with advice about how to move, to get a housing voucher with no restrictions. So you could just get a voucher, you could move to a poor or a rich neighborhood, or a control group that got no new assistance, but they continued to be eligible for public housing. And in 2002, one adult from each family was followed up and to examine 5 domains: economic self-sufficiency, mental health, physical health, risky behavior, and education. Did it make a difference if I made it possible for these poor people to move or to move to a rich neighborhood? Did it make a difference in their own lives? This shows the depression outcomes in the Moving to Opportunity study. So this is the percent with major depressive episodes according to whether you were in the control group at follow-up. So they had, I don't know, 20%, and those that moved to a low poverty neighborhood had substantially lower depression. So this experiment shows that if I could randomly assign people to have the opportunity, otherwise similar poor people with similar baseline characteristics, to have the opportunity to live in a rich neighborhood, it would lower their depression. And it also had an effect on obesity. Poor people randomly assigned to the opportunity to live in a rich neighborhood were less likely to be obese during follow-up. And other experiments have randomly assigned neighborhood exposure for non-health outcomes. This is another magnificently ingenious, cheap experiment that was done in the Netherlands. This is an alley in Groningen in the Netherlands, located in a shopping area, and it was commonly used to park bicycles. And what the scientists did is they experimentally manipulated the broken windows index. Here is how, of course, how it usually looked. And there's a little sign here that says no graffiti. And then they violated the rule, the no graffiti rule, and they put graffiti on the wall. So they changed the neighborhood experimentally. They created the disorder deliberately. And then participants, there were 77 participants in each condition, were all people who came to collect their parked bicycles. So this is the order condition, people park their bicycles. This is the disorder condition, people park their bicycles. And now the scientists put a little paper flyer onto people's handlebars in both conditions. And you have to remove the flyer if you're going to drive your bicycle. And in the flyer said, "We wish everybody happy holidays." And it was signed with the name of a non-existent sportswear shop. The flyer had to be removed by the participant in order to use their bicycle. But sneakily, there were no garbage cans in this alley either. And there was a sign that said no littering. So the question was, what fraction of the people littered in this condition versus this condition? And the answer was, these people put the flyer in their pocket, but these people who saw that there was disarray and that other norms were being violated threw the flyer on the ground, contributing to the cycle of social disarray. This is called a cross-norm inhibition effect. The cross-norm inhibition effect of violating the anti-graffiti norm on littering was quite substantial. Of the participants in the order condition, no graffiti, 33% littered. compared with 69% of the participants in the disorder condition. These scientists did other similar experiments. Here, the right-hand sign says, do not attach your bicycles to this gate. And this sign says, do not walk through this parking lot. You have to take a 200-meter detour and walk around it. And this is the target norm. We're trying to see, will we get people to violate this norm if we artificially violate this norm? In the order condition, 4 bicycles standing 1 meter before the fence were very visibly not locked to the fence. But in the disorder condition, the 4 bicycles were locked to the fence in clear violation of this norm. And the dependent variable was whether pedestrians conformed to the no throughway sign, the target norm, and walked around and took the 200-meter detour. And violating the no throughway ordinance meant stepping through the gap in this fence. And once again, that they found that the people who came back to collect their car from this parking lot were much more likely to violate the norm and walk through this opening when they saw that the bicycle norm had also been violated. So now you might be able to see how this disorder might say to you, you might live in an environment with disorder and say, hey, I'm going to go have unprotected sex, which means I get gonorrhea. These cross-norm inhibition effects that are illustrated in this experiment should trigger in your mind a sense of the mechanism by which living in a disordered environment might modify your individual level practice with respect to other behaviors that might in turn put your health at risk. So it's not the graffiti that harms your health. It's your laxity with respect to other norms at the individual level in an environment that has lots of graffiti. This is again different than the kind of crime example that I alluded to earlier with respect to the heat wave. Finally, these scientists did a very clever experiment with theft. They examined whether an envelope visibly containing a €5, which is about $5 note, and left hanging out of an envelope, out of a mailbox, would be stolen more often if a contextual norm was violated. So what they did is, it was very sneaky. They would put an envelope like this halfway into a mailbox, and then sometimes they put graffiti on the mailbox, and sometimes they did not. And then they would secretly watch what happened to people who walked by. Did they push the envelope into the mailbox, which is such an easy thing to do, to be kind to the person to whom this is addressed, or did they steal it? And they found that they could prompt theft in otherwise similar individuals just by putting graffiti on the mailbox. Another example of an experimentally created broken window situation which affected people's individual level behavior, structure versus agency, working across different kinds of behaviors. So neighborhoods can have an enduring character that affects multiple aspects of our lives and that stays constant across time. They are an aspect of the structure that surround us. Such work on health and neighborhoods, as we've seen, faces a set of complicated conceptual and methodological challenges. And the issue of how to define neighborhoods still remains. This also is a conceptually interesting and not just methodologically relevant problem. Do neighborhood effects operate at different levels of size? We've seen many different levels of size: hospital room size level neighborhoods, census block neighborhoods, hospital referral neighborhoods. These are all different levels of size, different levels of geographic aggregation. And it may be that the level of size that's relevant depends on the outcome. Are we interested, in counties or zip codes or census tracts or voting precincts or blocks or alleyways? And it may depend on what outcome we're thinking about. When you think about whether your neighborhood is safe or dirty, you think about a few blocks or whether there's a drug dealer next door. But when you think about whether your neighborhood has a hospital, you might think of the county level, a bigger level. You don't actually need to live right next door to the hospital. Within a mile is good. And when you think about whether the air is polluted or the laws are fairly enforced, you might think about broader levels still, like what state you're in. Overall, however, neighborhoods have an enduring reality that transcends the people within them, but that nevertheless affects them profoundly. Okay, now I can see your faces. Are you learning? You're learning. Good. Do you have any questions for me before I let you go? These experiments are ingenious, aren't they? They're very clever experiments. Some of them very expensive, like the moving to opportunity experiment. Thousands of people, you have to pay for their housing and move them versus just a few dozen people in the alleyway experiment. Yes, Severin.
I had a couple questions on the some of those experiments, but I was wondering maybe if they had run, or if it would be interesting to run certain other controls. Like what would happen, let's say in the graffiti experiment, if instead of graffiti it was looked like public art, or what would happen if you take away the sign that says no graffiti in that neighborhood? Would there be a difference if you see that visual no graffiti, and then you see breaking the law versus just graffiti, which you assume to be breaking the law?
So if you want to do such experiments and you're an undergraduate still next year, you're welcome to join my lab. You can design such experiments. We'll do them on the New Haven campus. If you were doing it this year, I would assign you to work with Maggie as your advisor, but Maggie's going to be a professor herself next year. But yes, you could do, that's exactly the way that science of this would proceed. You try to get a deeper mechanistic understanding, like how exactly is this working, by doing kind of little things like you described, and you might have a policy agenda. Which of these actually would I want to implement on a large scale? Which of these has a big effect or a small effect? I often wondered whether we could create cascades of joy by having happy people randomly assigned to certain locations in cross campus or in old campus, for example. Many of you may have had this experience in life when you're in kind of a glum mood. Who's had this experience? You leave your dorm room or your home, you're walking to work or to class, and you're kind of depressed, and then you walk past a busker. You guys know what buskers are? Street musicians. Whose mood is improved by buskers? Right? It affects your mood, right? And then you feel better, and then you interact with other people better. This busker is creating positive externalities. To my knowledge, no one has ever done an experiment testing this idea. So one could in principle do this type of experiment. Many possible experiments. Anything else, Severin, or anyone else? Yes, Alex.
So I understand that once there is some sort of disorder, there's kind of a spiraling effect, but is there an understanding of where, when it's not experimentally created, where the original disorder comes from?
No, that's a very good, and this is the enduring effects idea that, once these things get established, these norms can be sustained for a very, very long time. Remember, the first lecture in the class, we talked about how Yaleys and Marines and Red Sox fans, might have a kind of cultural character that transcends the individuals across time. And this is the whole Durkheimian idea. So yes, the neighborhood stems some kind of a character, but we don't know, let's say, how or when it started. This is why to do that experiment would be very difficult. But you could. One way you might be able to do it is to do it in Second Life or in SimCity or in some kind of massively multiplayer game where you could artificially create neighborhoods and slowly degrade them, or World of Warcraft and slowly degrade them, for example. Maybe you could test some of that idea. Okay, thank you. Next time we're going to have the midterm exam on Tuesday, then we have Thursday off, and I'll see you again in 10 days in this little venue.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.